The jungle itself had become a weapon. On August 19, 1942, near a feature marked on no detailed tactical map as Taiva Point, Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imi pressed his pencil into a diary already warped by the relentless humidity of Guadalcanal. The ink bled into the page, much like the confidence of the 917 men of Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's detachment, who had just completed a textbook nighttime insertion from destroyers. They moved through a labyrinth of palm trunks and strangling vines, their bodies tuned to the rhythm of infiltration warfare perfected over 5 years of conquest. Japanese command had assessed the enemy with surgical arrogance. Perhaps 2,000 United States Marines, soft conscripts from a decadent democracy, poorly trained and prone to panic. Colonel Ichiki had been told to wait for the main body of his regiment. He refused. "These are Americans," he told his assembled officers, his voice a blade of certainty. "We will sweep them into the sea before sunrise." What IMI and those elite veterans of China and Southeast Asia did not know, could not physiologically comprehend, was that they were stepping into a paradigm shift. They were not merely walking toward a battle. They were entering a systematic demolition of every tactical assumption, every strategic concept, and every ideological certainty that had defined the Imperial Japanese Army's way of war. The darkness that had been their ally since 1937 was about to betray them. The jungle, which they had always considered a neutral barrier to be overcome by spirit, was about to become an American force multiplier. And the myth of Japanese invincibility in close combat was, within hours, to be shattered not by a countercharge of bayonets, but by a wall of industrial-grade firepower the likes of which no human wave could ever hope to breach. This transformation had begun 2 weeks earlier, on August 7, 1942, when 11,000 Marines of the reinforced 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Lunga Point. General Alexander Vandegrift's Leathernecks were executing Operation Watchtower, the first American amphibious offensive of the Pacific War. The strategic arithmetic on the planning table in Washington was deceptively simple: seize the nearly completed Japanese airfield, establish a defensive perimeter, and hold it until relieved. The reality, however, was a vision of tropical hell unmatched in the annals of modern warfare. Guadalcanal itself stretched 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, a spine of volcanic mountains rising 8,000 feet into perpetual rain clouds. The coastal plain where the airfield sat was no paradise. It was a miasma of razor-sharp kunai grass, stagnant swamps, and triple canopy jungle so dense that visibility collapsed to mere feet. The atmosphere was a physical assault. Humidity never dipped below 90%. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick that men inhaled them, the vectors of a microscopic enemy that would eventually disable more combatants than bullets. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and fungal infections that dissolved skin were the silent snipers of the island. Yet, in those first hours, the Marines found the airstrip almost undefended. The 2,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops melted into the interior, abandoning food, heavy equipment, and the airfield itself. By nightfall on August 8th, American engineers were already grading the runway. They would name it Henderson Field, after a Marine aviator killed at Midway, and within days, the first aircraft of what history would anoint as the Cactus Air Force touched down, transforming the island into a stationary aircraft carrier that would dictate the entire rhythm of the campaign. The Imperial Japanese Navy's response was immediate, violent, and tactically brilliant. In the early hours of August 9th, Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa led a strike force of 7 cruisers and a destroyer down the narrow confines of the slot. The resulting Battle of Savo Island was a masterclass in night surface warfare and the worst blue water defeat in United States Navy history. 4 Allied heavy cruisers, Quincy, Vincennes, Astoria, and the Australian Canberra, were sent to the abyss in less than an hour, their steel torn open by devastating long-lance torpedo spreads. Over 1,000 sailors perished in flaming bunker oil. The surviving Allied naval forces, shocked and depleted, withdrew, taking with them the bulk of the food, medical supplies, and heavy ammunition that had not yet been unloaded. The Marines were stranded, cut off, and staring at a reinforced enemy with barely half their required combat load. However, what the Japanese High Command failed to grasp in the fog of tactical victory was a singular, unyielding fact. Henderson Field was the absolute center of gravity. An aircraft operating from a crushed coral runway could dominate a 200-mile radius of ocean during daylight. This reality forced the Japanese into a binary strategic rhythm that would bleed them dry. They owned the night, where fast destroyers of the Tokyo Express could dash in, deliver men, and escape before dawn. But when the sun rose, American radar and dive bombers ruled the sea lanes. Heavy artillery, tanks, and the massive tonnage of logistical sustenance required for sustained combat could not survive the daylight gauntlet. Japan's strategic imperative was to retake the airfield immediately, a task assigned to Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake's 17th Army at Rebel. The spearhead of this counteroffensive fell to Colonel Ichiki, an infantry school instructor with a firebrand reputation and an almost mystical contempt for Western material power. His regiment was a shock force originally intended for the cancelled Midway operation, and his orders, explicit and clear, were to wait for the rest of his regiment before engaging the enemy. Ichiki's tragic flaw was his inability to process a reality that contradicted the ethos of spiritual superiority. He had studied Western troops. They lacked discipline. They lacked will. They could not, in his calculated arrogance, withstand a screaming night charge of cold steel. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers deposited Ichiki's first echelon onto the killing ground. The landing at Taiva Point, 15 miles east of the American perimeter, was undetected, a smooth insertion that only reinforced Ichiki's conviction of his enemy's blindness. He dispatched a patrol of 31 men westward to assess the marine defenses. This routine tactical decision was the spark that detonated the trap. On August 19th, a marine patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, led by Captain Charles Brush, collided with the Japanese scouts near Coley Point. The firefight was brief, vicious, and one-sided. Every Japanese soldier was killed, but their deaths were not silent. Their map cases contained fresh documents that laid bare the entire Japanese order of battle and their catastrophic underestimation of American strength. Captain Brush raced back to the perimeter with the intelligence haul. General Vandegrift, a veteran of the Banana Wars and a meticulous student of defensive fires, immediately understood the calculus. The attack would come from the east, and it would come soon. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to anchor his defense at a natural choke point, a sandbar at the mouth of a tidal lagoon misidentified on maps as the Tenaru River. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, dug in along the west bank. They did not dig shallow foxholes. They built a fortress of interlocking fire. The M1917A1 Browning water-cooled heavy machine guns were the unsung backbone of this defense. Unlike the air-cooled Japanese Type 92, the M1917 could sustain a rate of 600 rounds per minute until the rifling was scrubbed smooth, provided the water jacket was kept full. Marines ran a hose from a pump into the river, creating a closed-loop cooling system. Every inch of the sandbar was pre-sighted. Barbed wire was strung to slow the advance. Artillery from the 11th Marines registered coordinates. And 37mm anti-tank guns were loaded not with armor-piercing shot, but with canister rounds, essentially massive shotgun shells packed with lead balls that turned the barrel into a wall of death. Just after midnight on August 21st, the Solomon Island scout Jacob Vuza, his body still bleeding from hours of torture by Japanese captors, staggered into the Marine lines with a final, singular warning. The Japanese were coming. Minutes later, the darkness exploded. Colonel Ichiki, ignoring the loss of his patrol and the evidence of the Americans' alertness, ordered a frontal human wave assault across the sandbar. Hundreds of soldiers of the Imperial Army, veterans hardened in the crucible of Manchuria, charged with fixed bayonets and screaming battle cries. They sprinted into a geometry of annihilation. The Brownings opened up, their muzzle flashes a continuous, strobing orange pulse. The .30-06 rounds cut through the column like a scythe, knocking men down in windrows. Those who made it past the machine guns found themselves facing the 37mm cannons. When those breech-loading guns fired canister, the sound was less of a bang and more of a violent ripping of the atmosphere, removing entire clusters of men from the physical plane in an instant. The attack continued for hours, a grotesque display of battlefield courage wasted against geometry and metallurgy. Some Japanese soldiers made it across the river and engaged in hand-to-hand combat, where Marines fought back with K-bar knives and rifle butts. But the line held. The interlocking fields of fire prevented any concentration of force. As dawn bled into the sky, Colonel Ichiki's attack had collapsed into a charnel house. Over 800 of his men lay dead on the sand and in the shallow, blood-stained surf. Vandegrift did not wait. He ordered a counterattack. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks rumbled across the sandbar, pivoting and spitting yellow flames from their 37mm cannons, systematically flushing the surviving Japanese from a coconut grove. The tank's canister rounds turned the grove into a defoliated slaughterhouse. By midday, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. The psychological blow to the Japanese survivors was as devastating as the physical annihilation. The Americans had not panicked. They had not broken. They had sat in prepared positions, weaponized the landscape, and erased an entire regiment's vanguard with the cold indifference of a factory assembly line. The disaster at the Tenaru did not slow the Japanese operational tempo. It merely revealed the depth of their institutional denial. The Tokyo Express accelerated. Between August 29th and September 4th, fast destroyers and light cruisers threaded the island chains, delivering almost 5,000 troops of Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taiva Point. This method of delivery was a strategic trap disguised as a tactical success. The destroyers could carry men, but they could not carry the heavy artillery, the mass rations, or the field hospitals needed to sustain a campaign. Soldiers arrived with only what they could hump on their backs. Kawaguchi, an ambitious and aggressive commander, planned a three-pronged assault designed to envelope Henderson Field from the south. His primary route was a ridgeline that dominated the interior, a narrow coral spine covered in razor grass. What Kawaguchi did not know was that Marine intelligence, specifically the elite raiders under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, had already identified this terrain feature as the most likely axis of advance. After a raid on Tasimboko village uncovered massive Japanese supply dumps, Edson had a premonition of the coming storm. He requested permission to dig in on that very ridge. Edson's tactical layout was a masterclass in defensive preparation. The ridge was a 1,000-meter-long spine of coral, flanked by steep, jungle-choked ravines. It was the perfect terrain for infiltration, but it was also, if correctly read, a killing ground that a small, well-supplied force could hold against a battalion. Edson's roughly 840 Marines from the 1st Raider and 1st Parachute Battalions did not just dig in, they engineered the landscape. Machine gun sectors were drawn with mathematical precision to create an impenetrable wall of intersecting fire. Mortar crews pre-registered the ravines. The 11th Marines, the artillery backbone, plotted defensive fire missions so close to the Marine lines that the forward observers could hear the shrapnel tearing the air inches above their helmets. On the night of September 12th, the full weight of Kawaguchi's assault broke against the ridge. Unlike Ichiki's blind charge, this was a sophisticated, swirling nightmare of close-quarters infiltration. Japanese soldiers climbed the steep ravines, probing for weak spots, trying to turn the flanks. In the absolute darkness, the fighting became elemental. Marines could smell the distinct odor of Japanese hair tonic and rotting rice before they saw the silhouettes. Hand grenades were tossed back and forth like hot stones. Edson's command post came under direct attack, the lines bending but never snapping. The tactical hero of the night was Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, who moved through the lines pointing out infiltration routes, but the systemic hero was the artillery. The 11th Marines fired over 2,000 rounds that night, a curtain of high explosive that shattered the Japanese rear echelon and broke the momentum of the attack. The second night, September 13th, was even more desperate. Kawaguchi threw his reserves into a final, screaming crescendo. At one point, Sergeant John Basilone, commanding a machine gun section, found his guns overheating and his crews dead. He ran through enemy fire barefoot, carrying a 200-pound belt of ammunition on his shoulders, preparing a gun in the dark with his bare hands. When the position was nearly overrun, he grabbed a .45 pistol and led a counterattack that restored the wall of fire. Barcelona's stand was the human apex of a system that was grinding Japanese courage into dust. By dawn on September 14th, the ridge was a floating island of dead. Kawaguchi's forces left approximately 830 to 850 dead on the slopes. The Marines suffered 104 killed. The ridge, forever after known as Bloody Ridge, was the first undeniable crack in the psychological armor of the Imperial Army. The Japanese survivors realized the terrifying truth: they could attack the Americans with the full force of their warrior code, and the Americans would simply absorb it, process it, and dismantle it with a volume of fire that turned heroism into a statistical irrelevance. It was in the aftermath of Bloody Ridge that the deeper, systemic collapse began to eat away at the Japanese fighting spirit. The logistical disparity had moved from a tactical inconvenience to a strategic death sentence. By October, the American supply chain, protected by the expanding umbrella of the Cactus Air Force, was a steady pipeline of canned rations, medical plasma, sulfur drugs for infection, and clean ammunition. A Marine machine gunner could fire until his barrel glowed cherry red, discard it, and have a replacement delivered within the hour. In contrast, a captured Japanese medical officer's report from late October laid bare the horror of their supply situation. Over 60% of the 17th Army's effectives were incapacitated by disease or malnutrition. Combat effectiveness had dropped to 30%. Soldiers were dying at a rate of 50 per day, not from shrapnel, but from starvation and the systematic failure of their own arteries of supply. The single rice ball was stretched to last 24 hours. Ammunition was so critically low that officers issued standing orders to fix bayonets rather than fire a rifle. The wounded were given a grenade, a place to lie, and an expectation of self-annihilation rather than surrender. The psychological anchor of the imperial soldier, the belief that spirit transcended matter, began to corrode under the acid of physical reality. Captured diaries from this period do not speak of tactical retreat. They speak of a slow, creeping realization that the American industrial machine was an invisible god of war that could not be appeased by courage. One entry described American artillery as a giant walking behind us, stepping on us one by one. The soldiers were not just fighting Leathernecks. They were fighting the output of Pittsburgh, Detroit, and the collective agricultural weight of the Midwest. The culmination of this attrition was the massive October offensive, the last serious attempt by Lieutenant General Hyakutake to smash through the perimeter. Hyakutake brought elements of the 2nd Division, fresh troops from China, and even a few precious Type 97 tanks that had been manhandled ashore. The plan was the most sophisticated yet, a coordinated multi-directional assault designed to pin American reserves and rupture the line. On October 23rd, the prelude began with a tank assault across the Tenaru River. It was a massacre of armor. Marine anti-tank gunners and a Sol M3 Stuart destroyed all 9 Japanese tanks in quick succession, the thin-skinned Japanese vehicles proving no match for the American guns. The main blow fell on the night of October 24th to the 25th. Over 5,000 men under Major General Yumio Nasu surged from the jungle against the positions held by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty, Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, and the newly arrived soldiers of the 164th Infantry Regiment. The assault was a test of whether American logistics could withstand Japanese willpower. It was a night of pure bedlam where the lines were defined only by the trajectory of tracer fire. Puller's Marines fought with the mechanical efficiency of a factory floor. The 11th Marines fired danger-close missions that were a physical wall of sound and steel, landing just yards in front of the foxholes. Artillery forward observers, cut off in observation posts, called in fire on their own positions, knowing that the bunker they built was the only thing between them and the blast. The ship USS Washington stood ready offshore, its 16-inch guns a promise of absolute demolition. The Japanese shattered against this wall. General Nasu was killed by machine gun fire, and his body was found clutching his sword, facing the enemy he could never reach. Over 2,000 Japanese soldiers died that night for no gain. By dawn, The offensive had collapsed, and the strategic initiative in the Pacific had, in the mind of every soldier in the theater, permanently shifted. The naval engagements that bracketed this land campaign sealed the fate of any Japanese soldier stranded on the island. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought from November 12th to 15th, was a series of brutal, point-blank gun duels in the confined waters of Iron Bottom Sound. On Friday the 13th, an American task force of cruisers and destroyers, outgunned but fiercely aggressive, collided with a Japanese bombardment force centered on the battleship High. In the chaos of a midnight knife fight, Admirals Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott became the only two American flag officers to die in surface action during the war, but their sacrifice bought time. The High, crippled by close-range cruiser fire that destroyed her steering, was left circling helplessly, and was sunk by the Cactus Air Force at dawn. The final death knell for Japanese heavy metal came the following night, when the battleship Kirishima returned for another attempt to pulverize Henderson Field. She ran directly into the radar-directed guns of the USS Washington. In 7 minutes of precise, devastating fire, the Washington put 9 16-inch shells and over 45-inch shells into Kirishima, reducing the Japanese battlecruiser to a flaming wreck. The bombardment threat to the airfield was permanently neutralized. The simultaneous destruction of a massive Japanese convoy loaded with the 38th Division's heavy equipment was the final logistical blow. Of 11 transports, 4 reached the beach, only to be set ablaze and destroyed by aircraft, artillery, and the relentless American fire system before they could discharge their critical cargo. Over 5,000 Japanese soldiers meant for the garrison never even set foot on the island. For the starving remnants of the 17th Army watching from the hills, the burning hulls on the horizon were the funeral pyres of their tactical doctrine. The Japanese High Command made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal in late December. They could not say they were retreating. The official language of the Imperial General Staff framed it as a transfer of the operational sphere. But for the officers who had seen the face of American systematic destruction, it was a capitulation of the intellect. Operation Ko, the evacuation, was executed with typical Japanese night fighting efficiency in early February 1943. Destroyers extracted exactly 10,652 men. These were not the 17,000 soldiers who were fit to fight. They were the scarecrows who were able to walk, many so emaciated they had to be carried aboard. They left behind an estimated 25,000 dead, a grim arithmetic of combat losses and starvation. The Americans, having suffered approximately 1,600 killed in action, had processed the loss, replaced the units, and stood ready to prosecute the next offensive. The technological delta that defined this outcome was staggering. The standard Imperial soldier carried a 6.5 mm Arisaka bolt-action rifle, a surgically precise but slow-firing relic of a previous generation. The American Marine was increasingly wielding the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that threw an 8-round clip of .30-06 as fast as a man could pull the trigger. In machine guns, the water-cooled Browning M1917A1 could fire indefinitely, a stark contrast to the air-cooled Japanese Type 96, which required frequent barrel changes and was prone to stoppages. The most devastating gap was in artillery coordination. The Americans had perfected the forward observer doctrine, a neural network linking an infantryman's binoculars to a battery's breech blocks within minutes. The Japanese artillery, when it existed, was often blind, limited to pre-registered fires because their forward communications equipment was fragile and scarce. This was no longer a contest of warriors. It was a contest of integrated systems, a revelation that broke the ideological backbone of the Japanese officer corps. What remains of Guadalcanal in the historical memory is not just a battle, but a brutal clinic on the nature of modern total war. For the Japanese veterans who survived the jungle and the starvation, the island was the graveyard of the warrior myth. Post-war testimonies reveal a consistent arc of psychological destruction: the initial arrogance, the first shock of the Tenaru machine guns, the disorienting realization at Bloody Ridge that American courage was equal to their own, and finally, the cold, creeping terror induced by the American supply chain. They learned that audacity could not strike a factory, that a charge could not sink a cargo ship, and that the spirit, no matter how fiercely forged in the fires of the Bushido Code, could not digest grass and bark into combat power. The American fighting man, by contrast, walked away from the jungle with a hard-earned empirical truth, that the Japanese soldier was a formidable, dedicated, and terrifyingly relentless adversary, but that when confronted with a systematic application of firepower, coordinated combined arms, and unbroken logistical support, he could be ground down to a statistical certainty. This was the fundamental transformation of the Pacific War. Guadalcanal was the moment the Imperial Japanese Army collided not with a soft democracy, but with a mobilized industrial civilization that had weaponized its entire productive capacity into a single, relentless machine of destruction. The question that echoes from those humid, blood-soaked ridges is not whether the Japanese fought bravely. They did, with a ferocity rarely matched in human history, but whether any tactical doctrine, no matter how spiritually refined, can ever truly withstand an enemy who has solved the equation of supply, mass, and systemic precision. The jungle of Guadalcanal stood as the silent, impartial judge, and its verdict was absolute.